Well, howdy, folks. My clock says 1 o'clock Central Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping notes here while we're sorting all of this stuff out, and hopefully everybody can hear me. If you can't, well, if you can't hear me, raise your hand. There we go. Click that little raise your hand button on there, and if you guys are hearing me all right, we will get started. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that very, very much. All right. Yeah, the housekeeping notes. Let's do that thing first. As you guys know, these are always recorded. You can post questions anytime. Use the Q&A box, please. There's a chat window, but the Q&A box is what I can see and what my assistant can see, and I will answer questions live as we go on. The recording for this will be available tomorrow. You'll get an email. If you registered, if you are the registrant, you will receive an email that lets you know how to access the recording, and you're welcome to share that with whoever you want to. So pay attention to that. So questions anytime. Email comes tomorrow. And let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar. What is your product or service worth? We're going to talk about the relationship between your market value, your cost, and the demand for that product or service. Lots of good stuff to go over here today, but first, I am your presenter, Tom Stimson. I am the president and founder of Stimson Group. I'm an advisor to the industry that I'm speaking to right now, which is audiovisual, live events, production, integration, and all the related fields that go with that. We're going to talk a lot about production pricing today, or production rental pricing, or rental pricing today, but we're on it, so feel free to ask your questions. Our Jumpstart Workshop sponsors, which help make this possible, are the good folks at AV Franklin, HireTrack, Lasso, Flex, Square AV here in Dallas, and our association sponsor, Avixa. And we have some 2019 sponsor programs we would love to talk to you about. If you're interested in also working with us on our December Jumpstart Workshop, we'd love to talk to you about that as well. Just feel free to reach out. So, why are we having this webinar? And that's the right question. What's this webinar all about? What's the purpose of having it? You know, where did this come from? What triggered Tom today to generate this webinar? I find that a lot of folks think there is mystery in pricing, and that pricing is some sort of voodoo. It's all made up, probably because I tell you sometimes that your pricing is made up. But that's the problem we want to solve today. You have a lot of made up pricing. I want you to have some pricing that is thought through and is based on something. And I'm going to show you how to base your pricing on something that you understand, perhaps even control. So we want to eliminate some of the mystery and how we go about pricing things, particularly in the service industry, where it's not as simple as buying a product at a cost and adding a margin to it. So much of what we do has blended costs built into it. It's very hard to define what your actual cost is, much less what you should be charging for it. One of the challenges we have, and this is emotions. We get very emotional about pricing. And whenever we apply emotions to pricing, we end up with a rather negative outcome. So I want to address that. That's the elephant in the room that we're going to talk about today. And then your self-worth, your confidence, and your credibility are all manifest in your price. And if you don't have a lot of self-worth, you're not confident, or your credibility in the marketplace is not very good, then your price is going to be effective, or what you can charge is going to be effective. So we need to take that into account, because that's going to affect what we can ask for. On the other hand, for some of us, that means that we need to be charging a lot more. Which brings me to my first story and my first example. I had a dad moment this last week. It was very, very timely. My youngest daughter graduated from USC Film School last year. She is an archivist. She works in cinema archives, which is different than film archives. Cinema archives work on the printed materials and the documents, whereas film archivists deal with, well, film and imagery. So she is looking for jobs. And by the way, if you need a really detail-oriented person in Southern California, my daughter's available. But she's doing some freelance work as an archivist while she looks for that dream archival job. And she had an opportunity to do some archive work for an author who was researching a book. And he basically just said, here's what I'll pay you. Which she, being a new freelancer, new at gigging, she just accepted. because she didn't have a whole lot of confidence. She was, she goes, well, that's the price that that's an hourly rate that I would take if I went to go work at a temp agency. So I'm going to take that as a freelance rate. Just because she's my daughter doesn't mean that she understands all of this yet. But she called me because she had the opportunity to do another gig. And she wanted to know what she could charge or what she should charge or how she should figure that out. And I said, great, let me ask a few questions. So tell me a little bit about what the replacement cost for what you do is. In other words, who else does it? And she thought about it. And she said, I've talked to my professors. Nobody else really does this. There are some professors, some tenured professors who do this sort of thing on the side, but there's not really anybody in the marketplace for her to go against on that. So one, we just learned that she's really scarce and that her replacement cost is pretty hard to define, but we'll get to that in a moment. And they said, okay, well, why doesn't your client or potential client do this for themselves? And she explained to me, well, they're writing a book. It's a huge book, but they're in Australia and they need about 10 hours worth of research in LA. So it's cost prohibitive for them to go do that. It's much easier to find somebody who can do that for them. So good. So now we're establishing value. Okay. So what's your value? What makes you valuable to them versus just hiring anybody to go into the archive and try and do this? And when she goes, well, not just anybody can walk into the archives. You have to, one, you have to be known to them. Two, you have to have some sort of credentials. You need to have a flexible schedule because the archive is only open certain numbers of hours. You have to have a relationship with the curators in order to get time because there's limited a number of people who can be researching at any given time. She went down a whole litany of items. I'm going, that's awesome. You just created a whole bunch of value right there. She also has a certification, which means that she's not only skilled in this, she's been tested for it, and she has professional experience doing it, and which means that she can do it quickly and efficiently. In other words, it's not going to take her a long time to research something. And then the other thing that added value is that she understands the researcher's goals, that she knows how to have the right conversation because she has worked for researchers in her development of these skills and getting her graduate degree. She understands what kind of questions to ask and how to follow up to get them what they actually need. So all of this is helping us to develop this picture of what it is that she's actually working in the marketplace. And so what about some other influences on your value? In other words, how optional is this information to the author that needs it? In other words, is this just, I would be nice, or is this actually important to them? And what's your, we call it the off the couch fee. What does it take to get you off the couch if all they want is find this doc, scan it, and send it to me? I mean, it literally could take 10 minutes to do this, but what's it worth to you to get in your car, drive across LA, get scheduled time in the archives, go in there, find this document, scan it, and send it. Okay. And then how credible are you? In other words, have you developed your website? What's your LinkedIn profile say? Okay. Does your reputation precede you? Do you have endorsements or recommendations from people that you've worked with? And then, of course, do you have capacity to all of this? And all of these affect what she's worth. And at the end of all of this, we got to her what was effectively a $20 an hour piece rate to a $250 minimum fee to just walk into the archive. And she's gone on and she's sold a couple of gigs since this conversation, so we know it worked. The point is, there's a lot of questions we need to be asking before we put a price on anything. So here are the problems that we have, and my daughter exhibited all of these problems in our conversation. And if I work with, any of my clients who are having issues with pricing, I find that they have a certain amount of overthinking, they have a certain amount of underthinking, and then they apply some victimization to their thought processes. And all of these skew the information in such a way that they get to a non-ideal outcome on pricing. So let's talk about each of these individually. Overthinking looks like this. Overthinking is, one, it's in the wrong order. We look outside the organization, we look at outside variables, and we think that those things matter first. What the customer thinks, what my competitors might do, what market is this in, what marketplaces things are going on, how's the economy. And we're letting all of these variables affect how we feel about our pricing. And we're incorrect about most of them because this is not where we are experts. A lot of this is conjecture. And as I start to present some quotes and some conversations that you have heard in your office before, you'll start to realize how much conjecture we're applying and guesswork to what we think things are worth. So overthinking is a problem because we're often incorrect about it. Then we underthink. Often when we have perfectly good data right in front of us, we don't look at it because we're too busy with the overthinking. So we have stuff that we can be absolutely correct about. We have key performance indicators based on a historical. We know what things cost. Okay? We can find out what market rates are. It's simply picking up the phone or sending an email and asking what the rate for something is. So often we ignore these data points because we've emotionally invested in our overthinking. So that outside imprecise information is clouding our perfectly good data and facts with a bunch of nonsense. And then add on top of that the human quality of feeling like a victim, feeling that we can't control the outside factors, so we have to ignore the manageable information because none of this is in our control. Woe is me. I'm a victim. I can't do any of this stuff. Very often where I hear this, I say, I'll say, guys, you need to charge more for this. Look, here it is. Here's the quantifiable data that says if you charge the price you're asking, you will lose money. And they will respond with something like, well, here's the thing. We have no sales pipeline. We're not busy at all during that time. We need to have this job. Therefore, we're going to have to sell it on price. And that's victim speak. That says that I can't do any better than selling on price, which is a really sad statement. Because the fact is, we're all much better than that. Okay? The fact that you can sign up for a webinar on a topic like this, I already know that you are better than a victim or the victim mentality that we often encounter. And what happens when we find ourselves, when we wrap ourselves up into the overthinking, the underthinking, and the victimization, is we end up in the death spiral. The reason that pricing is important is because the alternative is really ugly. The death spiral looks like this. When you subject yourself to the overthinking, underthinking, victimization, you will end up selling on price. That's what happens. That is our natural tendency. Our insecurities will lead us to sell on price. Our lack of information will force us to sell on price because the savvy buyer will use price to leverage your insecurities. And you'll believe them because you have no other reason not to believe them because you don't understand and you haven't looked at this objectively. So if we sell on price, we will start to lose money. At the very minimum, we will make less money than we should, which is going to lead to poor cash flow. In other words, I'm not going to have enough money in hand when I need it, which is going to force me to sell on price some more because I need to get the money in. In other words, selling on price creates the condition that forces me to sell on price. We dig in. We commit to selling on price. Now I have even less money, so I'm going to reduce my investments. I'm not going to buy new gear. I'm not going to hire the people that I need. I'm not going to invest in that software that's going to make me more efficient. I'm not going to make room for growth or do the things that are going to cause me to grow because it requires investment. So I'm going to lose more money, and I'm going to have even worse cash flow. And this can go on and on and on for years. And then you get to the point, and this is the writing on the wall, folks. When I'm taking a job sold on price because I want the deposit from the customer so I can pay my bills now, okay, that means we're at the point of no return. We've got to do something right away. When you're using deposits, unearned income to run your business, now you're in deep, deep trouble. Okay? You're effectively bankrupt on paper. Now, the good news about this is that there are many companies who can operate for years in this condition. Really, until somebody doesn't come in, until the banks come in and call the note or tell you that you have to pay back all your loans, you can continue to run a deficit like this. But you can be bankrupt on paper. It means that you can't risk any big mistakes. So Let me pause here. A couple of questions that come up. One of the questions that came up was a KPI, it's a key performance indicator. Somebody else answered. Thank you very much. Key performance indicator is a performance measurement. So for instance, a key performance indicator in an organization might be labor as a percentage of revenue. So outside direct labor, the amount of labor that I hire as a freelancer, in terms of freelancers, a normal for me might be 19%. So that's a key performance indicator. If I have a month where it's 30%, that indicator will tell me to ask why. Why did that happen? There may be a perfectly good reason, or they may not have been. All right, keep asking questions, folks. All right. I'm going to talk about some pricing conversations, because before we move any deeper into pricing, let's look at the language that we need to change inside of our organization. So I'm going to share some language that's going to be painfully familiar for some of you that's going on in your business. Now, here's some language that I call rental think. This is when we think that we're a commodity. Rental think is all about conflating with what you're worth, what it's worth to you, with what is actually worth. What something is worth to you is actually irrelevant when it comes to pricing. What is actually worth to the marketplace is what matters. Okay. So an example of this is, here's a product. The market is saying, hey, I want to pay you $1,000 a week for this in a rental product, but to you it's worth $2,000 a week because of all the things that it took you to get there. Okay. You've somehow convinced you that that price is more important than what the client or the marketplace is telling you. And that's rental think. Okay. If the market is telling us something about our pricing, we need to listen. And we also need to go back and do the math, because sometimes the market is lying to you. Sometimes the customer is telling you what the price should be, which is not the same as the market telling you what the price should be. Okay. We have sunk costs in our business. In the rental, particularly in video rental and lighting rental, we buy some really expensive things that are suddenly not worth very much, and just sometimes in a matter of months, if not weeks. And we come in, we buy those things, and I've got great stories about this from back in my era. Buying a product for $50,000, setting a rental price of about $10,000 a week, and then literally in 3 months, that product being worth zero. I mean, zero to the point where, there wasn't recycling back then, but I could have just thrown it in the dumpster and I would have been better off. But I couldn't rent it for anything. So it's a sunk cost. I just have to move on. So we have to get out of that rental think. And then the other thing we do in rental think is we look at what other people do and say, well, they can't make money at that rate, charging $1,000 a week. That's not a quantifiable statement. That's an anecdote. That's a personal belief. That's victimization. The fact is, people all the time make money. They just know how to make money differently than you do. Their utilization rate may be different. And there's a whole lot of factors that affect what price that they charge something, because maybe they're going through the things that I'm talking about here today. So if the marketplace is in conflict with your reality, your localized reality, your bubble think, okay, then we need to go through the process that I'm describing here today. There's also the imaginary pricing. So you have unverifiable assumptions that emotionalize decision. And this is very prevalent in, shall we say, sales-driven organizations. In other words, where salespeople seem to be gods or seem to know what everything is. And they say things like, the client won't pay that. And if you say, how do you know? They'll say, well, I just know, or the client told me. But the fact is, you can't verify that. There's something else going on behind that statement. I don't accept the client won't pay that unless you are the best salesperson in the world. Because that's just telling me that you didn't try to help the customer understand what something costs. The phrase, someone else will do it for less. And gosh, that's hard to argue with that. That's one of those things where, yeah, you're absolutely right. I can't argue with that. That is a true statement. It's an irrelevant statement, but it's true. Therefore, the question is, what have we done to be worth more than the person who will do it for less? There is always someone who would do it for less. And then there's the famous one, if I quote that, they'll never do business with us again. And that's when I get up out of my chair and say, look, if you would just use some sales skills, on the customer instead of on us, we might close more business. All right. So imaginary pricing is that feedback that we get that tries to sell us on what our pricing should be instead of us selling ourselves on what our pricing should be. And then another set of language is what I call the fear of competition or the fear of change. And that's that, I just want to, that's when people want to deny or reject all outside input. And they say things like, no one charges this much, but they have no research for that. That's emotional. We can't get money on a job that small. The size of projects starts to come into play when we're afraid of change, we're afraid of competition. We need this job because we have no other work available. That is a fear of competition. That is a fear of change. These are the kinds of conversations that we got to learn to quench in order to get our pricing correct. And then, here's one of my favorite sales sayings is, this is our best client. Anything that comes after this is our best client, okay, is I know I'm about to get sold something, okay? Pricing is a fact. Negotiation is a skill. So don't conflate the two things. The first thing we have to know is, what is something worth? I'm not saying we can't negotiate. I'm not saying that we can't help get closer to what the client wants to pay. The question is, what number are we going to start with on our journey there? Now, here's what we're going to do. First step is we got to focus more on real costs and figure out what our target margins are. Okay? And we're going to use market research and not speculation about things. Most of the things that we imagine, we can actually find real data for with just a little bit of effort. And we don't want to negotiate or manipulate any pricing until we have the complete picture. In other words, I've been through this quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I had a call with a client this morning going over a proposal where the sales team was trying to manipulate pricing on an individual item without looking at the entire picture. So they were trying to negotiate the outcome before we even knew what the job was worth. Let's look at what the entire job is, and then let's consider the other factors that you want to introduce into all of that. So that brings us to the part of the webinar you're probably here for, which is, how do we determine price? And there will be not a lot of math ahead, okay, but there's some really good stuff in here. Now, here are some hidden mistakes that I find all the time in businesses on pricing. If you have an internal cost advantage and you pass it on to the customer, especially on labor, you are doing yourself a disservice. Just because you happen to be in a marketplace where labor is inexpensive or your rent is low or any one of a number of factors, that's money for the company to keep, not a price concession in order to pass on to the customer. Okay? So there's a mistake many of us make. Anytime we add free or comped elements to something to try and increase the value to the customer or underquoting labor, it doesn't look like we're doing anything. It looks like it's a zero-sum exercise, but the fact is it's a potentially huge mistake, but at the very least it's a hidden mistake that we need to uncover in this process. So we need to out all of these free and comped things in our pricing process. And then pass-throughs is another hidden mistake. The client won't let us mark that up. Then why are we doing it? Okay. Pass-throughs have value to the customer. We need to figure out what they are, and we need to apply margin to collect that value. So these are very common things that we do. Most of you have seen it in your organizations. Now, here are the big mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes I see is measuring the profitability of a job against the net price. In other words, the price after discount. And if I'm measuring my gross profit against the net price, that says the discount didn't matter. That said the discount was free. There was nothing of value involved in that money. I would like you, if you do nothing else from this webinar, start looking at your jobs as gross profit as a percentage of the retail price before you made any discounts at all. For those of you who have a retail pricing scheme, which most rental production companies do, start with retail. Measure your profitability against retail. That makes discounts a job cost. Another big mistake, and I see it every day, I saw it today, was compromising on duration rules. So in the rental world, there's no hard and fast rule about how much, if a rental for one day is $1,000, what's a rental for a week? There's no hard and fast rules about this. There are market prices, there are traditions, and there are what people actually do. But we don't want to compromise on that. Once you've set your pricing rules about how you determine the price, do not compromise on that. Do not give somebody a day rate for a week-long job if your pricing is based on charging 3 times a day rate for a week. Okay? We can't fudge on what our baseline is. I'm not saying you can't negotiate. I'm not saying you can't discount. I'm saying you need to start with the real number. And underestimating labor on any not to exceed price. If we put in labor and we're not going to charge them for overtime, added people, or anything else, underestimating labor is the riskiest thing you can do. And most of us underestimate labor because it's emotional. Okay? We don't want the client to know what it really costs to do these things because somebody else is going to make it look like it costs less. And we're fearful of these things, but that's a huge mistake. And I've watched entire companies take themselves down simply because they were unwilling to look at labor as a real cost. So retail price matters, and we want to get to a retail price here. So let's have an example here of a scenario to why retail pricing matters. So let's assume that this is a rental production order, a production rental job. So we have a retail price for the job is $50,000. It's got equipment, it's got labor, it's got expenses, it's got all the stuff in it. There's a discount on this job of $20,000. Now, for rental people, we're assuming that this is a discount against the equipment. That's all good and fine. That gives us a net price of $30,000. Now, our expected cost of goods sold for many companies is just going to be inside and outside direct costs. So it's the labor, the things we can measure, because remember, rental equipment is free, right? It's just sitting on the shelf. It doesn't cost us anything. So we look at this job as we're getting $30,000 in revenue. We have $13,000 in costs. We're going to make 17 grand. My gross profit is 57%. I'm a hero. Except that that's not your gross profit. This is a $50,000 job that you got $30,000 for. Therefore, your gross profit is actually 34%. $17,000 over $50,000 is your gross profit. That's the one change most of us need to make so that we can reset our expectations on what a good gross profit number is. Real gross profit is much less than many of you think. For instance, if you're a rental company, you have an item that rents for $1,000 a week, that's the retail price, and it's just sitting on the shelf and somebody wants to give you $500 a week for it, well, sure, you're going to discount it and you're going to take the $500. Who wouldn't do that? That makes perfect sense. Except that $500 discount didn't cost anything in most of our math. So we'll take that $500 price, net price. We have no cost against it. Therefore, our gross profit is $500. Therefore, our gross profit percentage is 100%. But in fact, your gross profit is not 100%. You sold something worth $1,000 for $500. And we need to take that into account. That's why retail pricing matters. Now, to get to that retail price, we'll walk through a labor example because this is where I think people need the most help. Is we're going to start with the labor cost. Now, you have a cost basis in your company. You have a loaded employee rate on overtime is typically what I would use. Many of you will argue with me and say, well, we can only use the regular time rate. All right, I'm probably going to let you win that argument, but your actual cost basis is overtime. Because if you have an employee, they go over 40 hours, you have to pay them overtime. And the assumption is I have that employee because I'm going to have a high cost. I have an employee because I don't want to have a freelancer on this job because that cost basis will be high. Now, that's one basis of cost for labor is your internal cost basis. Another cost basis for labor is your replacement cost, which is a reasonable market rate. Now, that could be as simple as whatever XYZ labor company would charge you, or what a freelancer would charge you. Okay? What would it cost you to replace your employee if your employee wasn't available? Okay? That's our reasonable market rate replacement cost. And it can't be the unreasonable, hey, I know a guy whose off the couch price is $15 an hour. That's not reasonable, particularly if the job, if that person wasn't available, you'd be paying 25 or 30 or $40 an hour. Your replacement cost has to reflect what you can reasonably expect to pay. And then I want to take the higher of the two, and that's my starting number, but I have to add and subtract for different levels of skill and training or experience, the fit and finish, that clean cut person who can stand in front of the CEO and be credible and do a good job is worth more than the guy whose just appearance makes them look scary. So do you as a company add value to these individuals? That's what we want to know. Okay. Well, I got a question out here about factoring and overhead. I'm going to get there in just a minute. And then we want to set the expected margin. So once we figure out what our cost is, then we set the margin. So let's go through an example, and this will make more sense. So let's take an entry-level audio operator. And to put it in my terms, this is somebody who's going to run a small mixer with a couple of microphones and a couple of speakers on sticks, something very, very simple. Okay. The person I might use internally, say for instance, I'm paying them $25 an hour, but I have some overhead costs, but I have 30% of taxes and benefits. That's the minimum overhead I have to apply to them. So my internal cost at regular time is $32.50 an hour for this individual. Okay. But my replacement cost is a local freelancer who charges $35 an hour, and I'm going to add a reasonable 10% handling overhead. And that covers, one, the cost of somebody booking that person, processing their invoice, and getting them paid. So a small handling fee for doing that. So their real cost to me is about $38.50 an hour. So I have to take the higher of the two, right? If I put 30% margin on $38.50 an hour, that means my labor retail rate should be $55 an hour. And the way I get there, I said very little math here, $38.50 divided by 0.70, or 1 minus 30%, for you people who had algebra, equals 55. So that's how I get to a simple cost example. So if I have a cost, if I know what my replacement cost is, or what the higher of the two costs are, and I apply a margin to it, this is exactly what it looks like. Now, let's talk about the market. If I go out into the marketplace and I say, okay, I think I need to charge $55 an hour retail, and I go out into the marketplace and I look at my competitors, and I see company A charges 50, company B charges 55, company C charges 35, and company D charges 65. Well, what does that tell me? Well, it tells me there's a range, right? If of these four companies, company B is the closest in match to you competitively, then that's a good validation that starting at $55 an hour is a good place to be. Okay, that validates my calculation on cost, but we're not done yet, because you need to add or subtract to your market value. You just looked at 4 examples of somebody else's self-perceived market value. Your market value is how much more valuable or talented or awesome are you than company B. And you have to be honest here. I mean, you may not be as cool as they are. Maybe you're worth less than they are. Maybe you're worth more. Maybe you're company D or closer to company D. So we need to add a little bit based on where we think we are relative to those people in the marketplace. Now, we also have to add another factor here, which is risk and scarcity. Some things are risky, therefore they are worth more. Some things are scarce, therefore they are worth more. So if something is hard to source, it's worth more. A general audio operator in most markets, first, second, and even third tier markets, are not that hard to source. But a more rare person is. So we're going to put higher margin on that to compensate for that risk of scarcity. If somebody's job is risky, for instance, a rigger, I need to put more margin on it. They are worth more. If the job is subject to pricing volatility, that is worth more. So in other words, if the market rate changes frequently, that is something that is worth more. Which brings us to, here's how I do the calculated pricing. So I take all the information I just got. I've got my internal cost of $32.50 an hour for that individual. I've looked at some outside staffing companies and found a wholesale rate of $42.45. I found a freelance rate of $35 and $40. That means my average replacement cost is $38.90. Now, I've also looked out into the marketplace and seen that I've got company A, B, C, and D, and I understand what they charge. And their charge, well, company A, or I think it was company B that has the really low rate, I don't know where they got their pricing from. Maybe they're just using their internal cost only to do their pricing. But if I put 20 points or 20% margin on $38.90, I'm going to charge $48, $49. 25% is $52, 30% $55, on and on. I need to find where is my sweet spot in calculated pricing. Now, let's go, that's a very easy to source position. Let's go down here to a more difficult to source position. Oops, sorry. All right. Sorry, while I scan through everything real quickly again. All right. So now I go to this projection mapping job, which is one, a scarce job. It's a volatile price job. There's not many people who do it, and there's an awful lot at risk because that's the entire project. If the projection mapping doesn't go well, we're all in big trouble. We're going to have to comp the entire job. So I look at this projection mapping or video mapping job, and I find that my guy who does it internally costs me $45 an hour. Okay. I go to a staffing company, and theirs guys are 60 to 75. My freelancers are 60 and 55. My average replacement cost is about $60. If I want to make any money on this, I'm going to have to put some margin on it. How much margin should it be? Well, based on the fact that this person is, one, the job is risky, and two, scarce, I want to put as high a margin as I think the market will bear. So at 40% margin, that puts them about $100 an hour. That makes sense? Now, I have some timing issues. It doesn't always affect labor, but it does affect other things. So it really depends on how busy you are, right? Okay, so your gross profit has different value to you depending on how busy you are. Okay, you can lower your selling margins in slow periods, and you can capture valuable contribution margins. So that idea that when you're slow, go ahead and sell on price and take the contribution, that makes perfect sense. Okay, but don't compromise on labor margins unless there's an incredible demand and ready labor supply. So if you compromise labor margins, that means that there's a whole lot of replacement labor available. Anything less than that's going to get you into trouble. Now, some other pricing thoughts here, and we'll get to some more Q&A here in just a minute. So what's with the even number pricing, right? I don't know why we do this as an industry, why we've rounded everything off to even, and they're always in $5 increments, right? $55 an hour seems like a really arbitrary price. And if I'm a buyer and I'm looking at that $5 an hour price, why wouldn't I negotiate that? Particularly if your competitor is charging 50 and another one's charging 45. It seems very arbitrary. Negotiate it. Why don't you make it $57.90 an hour? I mean, who's going to quibble over the 5.27% anyway, right? People don't look at $57.90 an hour and say, whoa, man, your competitor's only charging 55. No, they're going to go, oh, okay. Obviously, labor is probably not negotiable here. It won't win every battle, but it'll win enough of them. And then the other thought is, why are you showing your math anyway? I mean, if anytime we put our math onto a quote and we show our customer how we got to the number, one, that's a failure of salesmanship. Two, you're compromising your negotiating position. And three, we're probably providing way more information than the client needs to make their decision. So let's show a little bit less math to our clients. Let's treat our pricing as fees, as something that's non-negotiable. Remember my story with my daughter. You know, a fee is something that you charge. A price is something you negotiate. So show your clients a few more fees and you're going to be better off. And remember that a lot of the things aren't really negotiable, particularly on this labor side. Now, get your pencils ready because this next piece is going to be really important to you. Here are some margins that I expect to find with my clients. If I'm looking at their profitability, here's what I want them to be working towards. Depending on what kind of business they're in, what kind of market they're in, what they do, what their value and scarcity is, I want to see 30 to 50% margin on the replacement cost for labor. Now, that may not be across the board, okay? The audio operator who's not scarce, that's going to be a lower margin. The video mapping expert might be a higher margin. But on the average, I'm going to see a blended margin of 30 to 50% on the replacement cost of labor. Margin and markup are not the same thing, kids. Okay? A 30% margin requires a 43% markup. Many of you use markup to figure out what your price should be. I'm going to add 30 points to it, is what we say. I'm going to take the dollar value and I'm going to multiply it by 1.3, and there's my retail price. You are leaving margin on the table. Okay? 30% margin means that you get a 30% yield. A 30% markup means you get less than 30% yield. So don't conflate margin and markup. So 30 to 50% margin is worth 43 to 100% markup on labor. That's what I'm looking for. On your rental equipment, you're going to make somewhere between 20 and 50% on the replacement cost of the rental equipment. Commoditized rental items, things like scaffolding and chain motors and conventional lights and no name, no blame microphones are the low margin. Okay? Things that are hard to source or uniquely packaged have a higher margin. Okay? So I want to see 20 to 50% margin, which is a 25% to 100% markup on the replacement cost. Again, don't mark things up across the board. Look at each item and consider where they fit into the marketplace. Supplies. Supplies are things that, you know, like expendables. I like to see a pretty high margin on these things, 30 to 50% as well, because you have to stock them. And if you don't stock them, you have to get them shipped in. So you have a fair amount of risk and a lot of overhead involved in order to procure them. So I want a pretty good markup on supplies. Expenses are things, you know, like travel and trucking and the things that we often pass through or put a very low margin on, and that's a mistake. At a minimum, I want to see 20 to 50% margin on these costs. If I am going to actually pass something through, in other words, I'm going to tell the client exactly what it costs, and I'm going to charge them exactly what it costs. I need to charge at least 10% more for that. I see this a lot in travel. People say, well, we'll do travel at cost. Not acknowledging that there's a lot of labor involved and risk involved in doing your own travel. But we're afraid to ask the client the hard questions that makes it more valuable to them. Like, well, what would it cost for you to do it if you want me to do it? So expenses, I want to see 25 to 100% markup on expenses. So those are some good ranges. Understand what they're doing. On labor, we want to compensate for risk and scarcity. On your rental equipment, you're compensating for your packaging or scarcity. Okay. On your supplies, it's about availability and holding cost. I mean, imagine you're a lighting company and you have to stock 400 different SKUs of gel or filters. Okay. How much does it cost to have all of that? All right. On expenses, you have risk and or the labor to procure those expense items. So we don't want to undervalue those. Now, can I tell the client that here's what it costs me and here's what I'm marking it up or here's the margin I'm applying to it? That probably wouldn't be ideal. Okay. We do have to apply some salesmanship to all of this. Which leads us to looking at the actual job when we're done pricing it, and figure out what our blended discounting actually did. So let's take a very simple rental order here. I've got $1,000 in labor, $1,500 in equipment, some supplies, some expenses, and here are the margins that I'm applying to those things to get to my retail price. So cost, expected margin, retail price. Now, the client may not want to spend $4,500. They may say, I really want to spend $4,000. Okay, great. I'm willing to accept a lower margin. I'm going to give you a 10% discount across the entire job. And then internally, I'm going, hey, I'm still netting 30% off the retail price. Not bad. That's on the low end, but within my target range. Matter of fact, if I look at all my items, my labor target, 30 to 50%, I'm well within there. My equipment target, I'm well within there. Well, not well within, but I am within. I'm doing great on supplies, okay? And I'm doing great on expenses. So overall, I hit the lower end of my target margin, but this tells my salespeople what they can negotiate to. And trust me, I wouldn't commission on anything less than your target margin. So if your target margin is 30%, commissions start when you get to 30%. Now, when we start putting all these things together into a project, that's going to start to affect your pricing, and I know that's a big concern for a lot of you. So a project price includes the value of all the quantifiable elements. Okay, we don't start blending them together and adding subjective values to this until we get to the quantifiable values based on our pricing calculations. So you also have, you have the quantifiable elements, you have the value of the deadline and or the deliverables that are involved in that. So if something has a specific due date, it's worth more than something that has a broad range of due date. And then you add or subtract for fit and finish of the deliverables. We all know that there are many different ways to accomplish the exact same thing. I can do sound for 1,000 people, and I can do it very simply with overhead speakers in the ceiling. I can put a very fancy line array in there. I can do everything in between, and it all meets the same scope of work, but not the same fit or finish. All right. And then we also have the value of the customer's expectations. So if a customer has a high expectation, and we've done a good job of in the sales qualification process, we can sell to that expectation. Okay? We can put the price, we can put the objects that meet that expectation, but also have an appropriate cost. And if they want a lower cost, then we can show them how we can exchange those items for an item that has a lower cost, but doesn't necessarily meet their expectations. Okay? Now, you can get into the whole argument, well, then they're just going to go somewhere else because somebody else will do it for less. Yes, that is all very, very true, but now we're talking about salesmanship. We have prices here right in front of us, right? The more credible your brand or you, the more value you can get out of your buyers. So if you have no credibility, you're going to get the lowest price possible. My daughter taking her first assignment at $20 an hour is because she had very little credibility. The client had very low expectations. Okay. But now that she understands how to better establish her credibility and to quantify the customer's expectations, she can command much higher pricing, and you can do the exact same thing. So price or value, don't be surprised if your value doesn't add to your price. You know what? I just bought a new truck here recently, and I hate the whole process of buying new cars because I think the entire dealership model is really, really sketchy. So I'm going through all the rigmarole of negotiating the price, and we're down to that last $500 that I don't want to budge on just because I'm tired of budging. And the salesman's trying to pitch me on how much value he's going to add to me after the sale, and how much he's going to support all my needs and follow up with me and all that kind of stuff. And I said, stop it right there. I said, kid, stop it right there. If you want to add value to me after the sale, never talk to me again. Say, you don't understand your customer. So the things that you think are adding value are actually taking it away. I actually want to drop another $500 off the price because I know you're going to follow up with me, make me fill out a survey, ask for testimonials, and all this other stuff that dealers go through. So don't be surprised if the things that you think are valuable actually aren't. So the sum of your price plus your value is where you want to sell. So if your integration of elements doesn't add value, then you can't charge more for it. So putting all the parts and pieces together doesn't necessarily add value, but it should. All right, so I'm gonna give you a moment. I've got a couple questions coming in. I want to answer them. We have plenty of time for that. If you've got more questions, please ask them or write them into the Q&A box if you don't mind. And before we do that, I want to tell you what next month's webinar is, because I've gotten kind of serialized in my webinars this fall. Next month, we're going to talk about budgeting, and specifically for your 2019 fiscal budget, and how to estimate revenue. Seems to be the biggest problem my clients have. We know how to look at expenses, we have historical, but we're really fuzzy on how to estimate revenue. So if I'm going to have a good forecast and budget for the next year, I've got to figure this out. And fortunately for all of us, I'm really good at estimating revenue. I did this for years. I was quite effective at it. I've got a great track record of it. So I will share with you how I do that and all the variables that we consider to help you get to a revenue estimate, and then how to maintain that estimate throughout the year. Because your revenue forecast is what helps you run your company, and it tells you when you need to adjust your budget. Now, Jumpstart workshops, always a reminder, we've got one more this season in December. We have the Jumpstart Management Workshop. Then we're going to have more. We'll have a schedule for 2019 coming out very soon. So December 4th and 5th in Dallas is the Management Workshop. This is targeting owners and top management and your up-and-coming management. We're going to show people a lot of the different elements you take. The marketing will start for that very soon, but just mark your calendar. And then also mark December 6th to stay over one more day. And pretty soon we'll be talking about the AV Matters Roadshow. We've got a one-day boutique expo with some more valuable content for you. That's all for free. Just stay over an extra day. I know you'll enjoy it. And Dallas in December, beautiful, beautiful weather. Make sure you're on my mailing list. If you registered yourself for this webinar, you are on the mailing list. Don't worry, you'll hear from me again. If you are a hanger-on, or if you're watching somebody else's webinar, go to my website, trstimson.com, click download your free ebook, give me your email address. I'll send you a free copy of my book, Learning to Expect Better, in digital format, and we'll get you registered for the Intentional Success newsletter that comes out every Monday morning. Great content every week, valuable stuff, help you run your business better. And while you're there, if you're the business owner, or if anybody you have a question you'd like to discuss with me, go to the contact page and schedule a free call with me. It'll take you to my calendar. Happy to have a conversation with anyone. I really enjoy that. Great part of my job. Once again, thank all of our sponsors. You guys are awesome. Thanks for making this possible. And now let's talk about those questions. All right, I got a couple questions on here. And so we answered about factoring and overhead earlier on, so we'll get rid of that one. The question is, what about union labor? So union labor is an outside cost, right? So we know what that cost is. We get a quote, here's the cost. You know, let's say the person is $50 an hour. That is your cost after they've loaded all their fees on top of that, okay? I need to add margin to that, okay? Procuring union labor and assuming the risk of managing a union crew is valuable. Now, it may be difficult if you're going into Chicago and you're having to pay $100 an hour for a stagehand to tell the client it's going to cost them $130 or $140. That's up to you how much margin you put on that. But my recommendation is put margin on it because it is valuable for you to do that. You have to management. And the whole argument that the customer, well, if the customer pays the bill direct because they don't want the markup, well, wait a minute, then you need to charge them a huge project management fee for managing that. But if the customer wants to assume all the risk, just make sure that you're charging the fee for managing the order, because they're still going to hold you accountable if things don't work. Another question here. I think this got answered about what does the replacement cost of labor mean. Replacement cost is what does it cost you to actually get it yourself. So if you have internal labor, I say that your replacement cost is the overtime for that person. So if you have a person who makes 20 bucks an hour, the overtime rate is 30 bucks an hour. Their fully loaded rate, which their taxes and everything, puts them about $35 an hour. That is my replacement cost for that person. So if I need to add one more person internally, it's $35 an hour because the assumption is they're going to be on overtime, right? So hopefully that answers the replacement cost. So I have one more question here to answer. Oh, it just went away. We spent the last few years setting prices based on replacement cost market research. Still, there are many times we have sent quotes and that end up scaring off customers. Yep. This has led to low confidence in methodology and a reversion to the old way, which relies on deep discounting. If we don't have super salesmanship, what can we do? That's a great question, all right? So that speaks to the issue of confidence. As a matter of fact, I know I just wrote a blog post about this very thing. I don't know when it's coming out, but it will be in one of the next coming Mondays, Intentional Success. We talk exactly about this. Go back to the fundamentals. This is about labor. And so I will tell you about labor. If you're showing your customers your labor pricing and you're getting a lot of rejection, then you've probably misread your audience. In other words, you can't command, your credibility doesn't command the margins, or the scarcity of what you're doing doesn't command the margins that you're asking for. So you might need to reduce your margins, but more than likely you need to find other ways to discount or increase your value through better salesmanship. So the discipline that's involved here, and this is a great question, but the discipline that's involved here is protect your labor margins. Whatever you decide they are, protect them and use your other skills in marketing and salesmanship and negotiating on equipment discounts, for instance. And I know this is coming from a production rental company. Most of you, if you will protect your labor rates, you can afford to discount much more heavily on your equipment rentals. If your equipment rental pricing is based on market rates, you know, your replacement cost plus a margin, you can afford a lower margin on that. Okay, so the labor needs a higher margin because that's how labor scales. You sometimes have to use more labor than you can charge for because that's the risk of labor. If this person underperforms and I have to backfill with somebody else, that's the risk that goes with being a labor provider. I have to eat that. If somebody makes a mistake, I have to eat that. On equipment, my risk is actually much lower. And this is quite a bit different from many of us who started companies 20 and 30 years ago. We made huge margins on equipment and very small margins on labor. We gave labor away for free because we made so much money on equipment. Now, the formula is reversed. Most of your profit in a production rental environment should be on labor. Okay, your negotiable profit is on the equipment that you own. And you'll have to learn to accept lower margins, net margins on the equipment in order to get the net margin on the job, the blended job that you need. So the discipline is to go back and look at the blended margin of the job and negotiate from there. So I know it's a convoluted answer to a very difficult question, but protect your labor margins at all costs. So, all right, I don't see any other questions popping up that haven't already been answered, so let me give you a couple of final thoughts and we'll let you get back on your way writing quotes. So your pricing, and this speaks to the last question as well, your pricing must have integrity and consistency. Okay, do the research. Okay, if you do the research, you will have integrity and consistency in the pricing. Believe your research. If you don't like your research, do more research, but let the numbers speak for themselves. Also consider your relative value in the market, okay? If you're in a marketplace where there's lots of low value providers or low margin providers, that's going to affect what you can make, okay? Either you need to have a lot more high value customers available to you, which would require great marketing and great selectivity. But if you're going after the same pool as your competitors and their margins are very low, you're going to be forced into a lower margin world. So data is your friend. It'll tell you where you can be. And by the way, people pushing back on your price is a data point, but it's not a decision point. Okay? You should be losing some jobs. You need to know what is an appropriate close rate for you. If your close rate is 80%, I guarantee you your pricing is too low, particularly if you're in a price-sensitive marketplace. Okay. And then after you've got your pricing figured out, the only remaining variables are demand and scarcity. If demand and scarcity are low, you need to rethink your marketing and retool your sales approach. Okay. Your market won't pay you the margins that you should earn, so you need to change what your market actually is and who you're going after or where you fit into the value chain. So that becomes a strategy question. So those are my thoughts for today. I hope this was valuable to you. Please email me questions if you have any. And I will we'll have this recording up for you tomorrow so that you can share it with the rest of your team. So thanks, guys, for giving me an hour of your day, and have a great one. Happy selling.